Hello and welcome to Things Are Getting Strange. I'm Nick.
And I'm Kim.
And Kim, you look resplendent with your spider headband on today in the run-up to Halloween. We've got a lot of Halloween decorations, as you might imagine.
It seemed appropriate.
Favourite Halloween decoration at the moment?
It's definitely still the very fake-looking stuffed crow in a bell jar.
Who we call Jon Snow for reasons...
He knows nothing.
He knows nothing. We love Jon Snow. Not the character, you understand, the crow in the bell jar. Today, then, there's no X-Files news of anything that I've seen of late.
No, though I am getting a bit addicted to the Muldle.app online.
Oh, yeah.
Which is Muldle.app, if you would like to try it.
I do need to give this a go as well, but you've been doing quite well with it, I seem to remember.
Yeah, I got it first try today. It's basically Wordle, but for X-Files fans, so it shows you up to 6 images and you've got to guess the name of the episode.
See, I'd seen this done for There Might Be Giants Wordle, which is Guess There Might Be Giants song from the intro sequence, or something like that, but I did not know the X-Files had an equivalent of it.
Today's, I think, was Never Again, but I got it from the first guest. Some of them have been a bit more tricky. Like, there was one the other day where the first image was just a picture of a 1-cent coin, which I must admit I didn't get it from that.
But you told me afterwards, and of course it all makes obvious sense in the end. It's Dreamland.
Yes, correct.
It's a nice idea. I like it. I do like all the various clones of Wordle we've got at the moment, the bizarre ones like that.
Yeah, that's been my favourite one that I've played, but obviously relevant interests and all that.
Yes. Muldle.app, Kim recommends Muldle at the moment.
If you follow us on our Twitter account, which is @GetStrange42, you'll certainly see me playing Muldle quite a bit.
Cool. Well, in the absence of any other news, shall we get into some episodes? Today we are talking about Deep Throat and Squeeze, being episodes 2 and 3 of The X-Files. So, Deep Throat was first broadcast on the 17th of September 1993. It was directed by Daniel Sackheim, written by Chris Carter. Of the notable guest stars, we've got Jerry Hardin, who plays a character known only as Deep Throat. More on that in a second. Other things you might have seen him in, he's in Big Trouble in Little China in the pre-credit sequence that has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the film, and looks like a weird narrative device that never actually came to fruition. He's most famous for The Firm, which is where Chris Carter saw him to hire him. But he's also been in Star Trek. Apparently he's in Next Generation and Voyager. Of other weird connections, though, he is the father of Melora Hardin, who played Jan Levinson on the US version of The Office.
Huh.
The other guest star of note is Seth Green. He was Oz on Buffy, very famously. Scott Evil in Austin Powers. He was also, and this is going for the whole, I hope every episode doesn't come back to Buffy ultimately, but he was also in a film called My Stepmother is an Alien, which he co-starred with Alison Hannigan, who played Willow on Buffy.
Who was his girlfriend in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I think I know him best from Idle Hands, though.
Oh, and Idle Hands, of course, yes. The Evil Dead 2 kind of tribute.
It's a horror comedy about a kid whose hand gets possessed, particularly when he chops it off.
Yeah, so the hand sequence in Evil Dead 2 expanded out to an entire film, and lots of stoner comedy.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's worth a watch.
I think we'll do a synopsis for Deep Throat first. Mulder is warned off investigating an Air Force pilot missing persons case by a mysterious older man in Washington, D.C. Subsequent to this, Mulder learns his phone is being tapped and he's actually under surveillance outside his building. He and Scully travel to Idaho to meet with Mrs. Budahas, who has reported her husband's missing person case. She takes him to meet another pilot who was formerly missing, who has been returned to his wife but is now behaving rather oddly and seeming a bit autistic. Attempting to contact the military base gets them the brush off, but they end up meeting a local reporter called Paul Mossinger. He refers them to a UFO-themed diner in the area, because it turns out that this area is a UFO hotspot centered in and around the base. Mulder winds up buying one of the diner owner's pictures of a black triangle she said she saw in the sky outside the diner one evening. Based on her tip, they make their way to the base at night and witness what could be craft making impossible maneuvers in the night sky. They are then chased away by a black helicopter where they meet 2 teens, ML and Zoe, ML being played by Seth Green. Mulder and Scully rescue them, and Mulder gets information about the base and the various craft these 2 teens have witnessed. In amongst this, Mr. Budahas, the pilot, is unexpectedly returned and freaks out his wife, who insists that this is not her husband. He looks physically like him, but he's not behaving correctly. After this meeting, Mulder and Scully are stopped by men in black, who destroy all the photos they have taken and suggest they leave town. Undeterred, Mulder sneaks back onto the base with help from Emil and Zoe, and that night witnesses a black triangular craft and is then captured by a security detail. Scully, meanwhile, realises Paul Mossinger is in fact one of the base commandos and forces him at gunpoint to get Mulder back from the military. Mulder is traded back with her, but he looks groggy and dishevelled and seems to have had his memory wiped. After this, some days later, he meets with his informant, who we will refer to as Deep Throat from now on, which is his character name, who reiterates his attempt to warn him, and then confirms to Mulder that aliens are real and have been on Earth for a very long time. What did you make of Deep Throat?
I've got to admit, after the first episode, it felt a little less exciting. I guess it's just the whole basis of this one kind of focuses more on a kidnapping rather than a murder, so you don't have that immediate sort of intense mystery to solve.
No, and the other thing that struck me about it was it's a second pilot. Because you get the reset the premise very, very quickly. But I think, like with a lot of pilots going into series, they've decided to refocus Scully's character because she is not being wavered in the same way she was in the pilot. She's not coming around to Mulder's way of thinking whatsoever. She's staunchly critical and sceptical.
The Scully in both versions strictly follows Occam's razor, which, in case you've not heard of it, is the concept that the simplest explanation, all things being equal, is usually the correct one. However, the Scully in the pilot, I would say, was more focused on the fact that if the simplest explanation was the supernatural, she's not going to rule it out.
Yes.
Whereas this Scully outwardly will call Mulder crazy if he suggests anything like that.
Yes, at no point do we get... There's actually no sense that she's been through the events of the pilot, that she's experienced nothing of that event, isn't it? Because basically, I don't believe in UFOs, Mulder, you're crazy.
Yeah, it's particularly in that scene that you mentioned where he buys the photograph in the Flying Saucer Diner.
Yes.
Where she actively calls him a sucker in front of the woman selling him the picture. And she then voices the fact that she's worried about writing about this in her field report, which in the first one, she wasn't so much worried as the fact that she will present the field report just saying it was inconclusive.
Yes. Well, the other part I think we mentioned last week was the whole, she's perfectly willing to believe until she realises she has to justify it in a field report, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But now she's very much, she's opposed to Mulder. She's basically on the opposite side to Mulder. Mulder is all about beliefs and Scully is all about rational science at the moment.
True. Which is why Scully will kind of liken what's going on to Project Aurora, I think we call it.
Yes, we do mention the Aurora Project is a series of secretive spy plane craft that have been tested by the US military.
I think the concept of Aurora is it's the kind of poorly kept secret as well.
Yeah, it's a very open secret.
It's a very open secret that the US were testing these kind of experimental aircraft. But whereas Mulder is happy to assume that these aircraft are built with alien technology, Scully just thinks they are very high-tech aircraft.
Yes, and we'll get to that later with your conspiracy, with more of the conspiracy talk of exactly what's so special about the craft they've got here. One of the other things I think to note on this episode is it's the first time we have the X-Files intro sequence.
Ah, yes.
Which looks, it must be said, very dated at this point. There's a lot of very awkward stuff going on in there.
It's so iconic, though, with all the images like the germinating seeds and the screaming face.
But it's the text floating over things. It just doesn't...
Oh, government denies knowledge.
Yeah, it's because that doesn't have the same ring to it used to. It looks dated, it must be said.
It's so iconic, though.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't dislike it.
No, you can't dislike it. And the tune, everyone recognises the tune. It's very, very famous.
By Mark Snow.
By Mark Snow. Who would get to compose all the music for the series as well.
Mm-hmm.
One notable thing I would want to just say about the intro sequence is the shot of Mulder and Scully entering a room is in fact from the next episode in our list, Squeeze, which we're going to get to a bit later.
Mm-hmm.
The other part is there is I don't know if it's wrong or deliberately changed on the agent's FBI badges. So when the camera zooms in to Mulder and Scully's photos on the ID badges, if you look at the text written below it, it states they are the Federal Bureau of Justice, Department of Investigation. Not the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Justice.
Oh, I see. I presume that is a mistake on actual FBI badges.
Yes, as far as I'm aware, it should be Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I think it's changed purely in case someone tries to use this to make a fake FBI badge for whatever reason.
That's very funny.
They're tiny, trivial little change.
I never would have noticed that. Good spot.
Thank you. The other thing, of course, is, as we alluded to last time, this time we actually get a cold open. Although, we're probably going to jump around a bit on this, but I don't think this cold open goes anywhere properly. It sets up the missing man, and this is how he gets captured by the military.
The drama of the opening in this one, if you have not seen the episode, is it begins with a kind of SWAT team converging on the Buddha house, to find him huddled in his underwear in the course of one room, covered in what looks like maybe second-degree burns.
Yes, all right. We get no explanation for what that was. We also don't get, kind of interesting, is he commented a military vehicle, apparently. We don't know what that was or what he was doing with it.
It does establish in the episodes that these kind of pilots are having mental breakdowns.
Yes.
So I suppose you could just attribute to this as this is his mental break.
Yeah. But the burns took them by surprise. They were not expected to see him burned.
No, I don't think they mentioned that with any of the other pilots, that they had a burn or a rash, whatever this skin complaint's supposed to be.
Well, she mentions a rash later when she's talking to Muldle and Scully, but she doesn't... The burn, they don't refer to it as burns, and the rash was something he was developing earlier.
Mm. He doesn't have them when he's returned, either.
No, he looks perfectly fine when he's returned.
The other thing that struck me about the early parts in this episode is when Mulder picks up this investigation at the start, is you have your first kind of elements of FBI corruption.
Yes,
in the series.
The drop in the case.
We saw it a little in the pilot, but it wasn't so much FBI corruption. It was more the idea that there's this kind of higher level need to know things. And, the people at the lower ranks might not know things, but the upper Ecleans do.
Yes.
This cabal that's kind of put Scully onto the X-Files. But in this episode, you get the idea that the military is actually the most important power in here, or the Department of Defense. And the FBI are kind of subservient to that, because the military can just put a kibosh on any investigation they want.
The military as a authority in this episode is very strong, but it's not clear if the FBI case has been shut down was thanks to the military, or that's the general conspiracy overlaying everything.
You have the idea when Mulder is actually in Idaho, was this episode set?
Idaho.
When they actually reach Idaho and they speak to the Men in Black, though, the Men in Black actively tell them that he must stop investigating this, the case is closed.
Yes.
Which infers the fact that the military just has this power to carte blanche, say, nope, that case is off the table. It's shut, no solutions.
Very true. We should talk about Mulder's informant, Mr. Deepthroat.
Who I don't think is named in this episode.
He's not there. He's credited as Deepthroat. He's not called Deepthroat, but that's the best moniker we've got to refer to him as mentioned, he's played by Jerry Hardin. I was kind of wondering if he's got a touch of theatrics to him. I realise that sounds confusing. What I mean is, Deepthroat first meets Mulder in the bathroom of this bar, which he's inexplicably meeting Scully at, which is one of these oddities. Why aren't they at work? It's 2 PM apparently, and they're meeting in a bar. And it doesn't look like Scully's there for lunch, and Mulder almost seems to kiss her. Very strange stuff in this episode. But Deepthroat meets Mulder in the men's room and locks the door. And basically someone bangs on the door and trying to get in, as he's explained to Mulder that he doesn't want him to investigate the case. Deepthroat undoes the door and goes out, but as he does so, a guy coming the other direction bumps into Mulder. And by the time Mulder gets out into the main part of the bar, Deepthroat's nowhere in sight.
He apparently has teleportation powers.
Yes, teleportation powers, but my point about the theatrics was, is the guy on the outside set up so that Deepthroat can make that slip away?
That's an interesting idea. I kind of read it the other way, as I was wondering if Deepthroat is avoiding other people. And, could this be some other sort of government agent that Deepthroat is trying to avoid and doesn't want to be seen talking with Mulder?
It's possible as well. We don't know a lot about Deepthroat at this point in time.
Or, of course, it could be a drunk just wanting to use the bathroom.
It could, but then again, this is the whole nature of interpretation and mystery, and we don't know fully which way we're going.
Knowing conspiracies are there, you start to suspect everyone.
And do we respect everyone at this point? A good question would be, why is Deepthroat so named? Deepthroat is named for the real-world person who is... Informant. Informant's a good word. Who was famously referred to as Deepthroat by the Washington Post in the Watergate scandal. He was dubbed Deepthroat by the managing director of the Washington Post, whose name was Howard Simons. This was both to allude to the deep background status of the informant, and also the pornographic film by the same name. In 2005, there was an article in Vanity Fair which confirmed the identity of Deepthroat, who was the assistant director of the FBI, Mark Felt. This has been disputed by some people, despite the fact the Washington Post journalist who cracked the Watergate scandal story confirmed that he was in fact their informant. There are strange questions lingering over it and other possibilities for his identity. One of the oddities is that apparently the way of communicating with Deepthroat wouldn't actually work in the real world, which involved moving flower pots. And the balcony where apparently he was doing this wasn't visible from the road, so quite how this was meant to work, no one's entirely sure.
Curious. So you've got a real world conspiracy there.
A world conspiracy, and Deepthroat might not in fact be who they said he was. So Deepthroat is drawing on a real world conspiracy and an informant, and someone who says he has help to give to Mulder if it will help him. And he says it's kind of curious thing if he takes some interest in his work, and quite what Mulder's work is Bit vague, because I'm not sure how much the public gets to know about the FBI investigations of X-Files.
You had a concept in the first one of the fact that if Mulder investigates into this, the public will have more knowledge of it.
Yes.
So there must be some idea of there is a public way, I suppose, of learning about closed cases. I imagine, like the real police force, you can't learn much about an investigation while it's ongoing, but once closed, it becomes a different matter.
That's true. I mean, can you imagine in the current government in America, the Republican Party, finding out the FBI has a guy investigating this stuff?
It would be amazing.
It would be amazing, but the outrage, the fury, Mulder hauled up onto the stand to testify to Congress why he's doing this.
Our taxpayers' dollars paying for this lunatic to investigate Bigfoot.
Yeah, and this other person who follows him around trying to dispute everything he says. Can we not just close it down and redirect the money to something like tax cuts for the rich? So, interesting in that Mulder is under surveillance on this episode for nothing more than being curious about a missing persons case. This immediately sort of gives the impression there is something happening for his phone to be bugged and for an unmarked van to be parked across the street with someone who does seem to be observing the building.
This sequence immediately following on from Deep Throat warning him off as well.
Yes, so there's something up about the events of this. Though it's kind of small scale, ultimately, what the conspiracy is. This level of protection over this one incident feels excessive.
I suppose, even though it does feel like it's excessive compared to the last episode where aliens were potentially possessing teenagers to kill people. This episode is more about military secrets, and of course all governments, not just America, are really protective about their kind of military-grade technology.
It's true, but you would also think that if you're going to fly experimental craft in the sky, you'd make sure that you turn off the running lights so you can't see them from the ground.
This is true. I presume the idea we're going off is this would have been early 90s, so you're getting off the back of the Cold War. We don't want the Russians to know about our UFO technology.
Still, turn the running lights off. By stealth. I think the interesting point I thought as well, though, about when they do see the craft, well, the alleged craft in the night sky, doing the impossible manoeuvres, is Scully does suggest they could be lasers fired from the ground onto a cloud layer. And there's not actually a lot to dispute that, other than the kind of thunderclap when they sort of rise up into the sky.
There is the bit that's never recreated where Scully's sat in the car and there's a kind of sonic boom that smashes the back windscreen.
Yeah, and it's not clear what that was or why that doesn't happen again.
But it happens directly before Mulder takes her up the hillside to look at the lights, so
yes.
You've got to assume it's one of these crafts flying overhead. Though it's the only time in the episode it does any damage like that.
Yeah, and that also back windscreen is remarkable. Is fixed at some intervening point. We don't see how.
To be fair, I didn't check that. My wondering is if they've got a new hire vehicle in the meantime or something.
It could be. The other thing, though, I was thinking about this for the craft, though, is it's all very well, as postulated in this episode, that basically wreckage from the Roswell crash, of which Mulder has a photo of, which I'm pretty sure does not exist in the real world. I'm pretty sure before the Roswell crash there are no photos of the alleged alien craft coming down.
No, the only one I'm aware of is the really famous one with the man holding the wreckage.
But in this episode, Mulder allegedly has a photo of the UFO of the Roswell crash pre-crash, and it's a black triangle just like the one that's seen over the military base. Getting past the whole "where did you get this from, Mulder?" is the theory is that they're building ultra new aeroplanes for the US military using alien technology from Roswell. It's taken them 50 years to get right.
Mm-hmm.
If we accept this premise, you are putting human pilots into these things. Reaction time is a factor that humans are going to have a hard limit on. And so that bit where the two ships zoom right to each other, stop a fraction of a distance apart, and then go in a different direction, that's going to be incredibly difficult for a human pilot to do.
That's a very good point, even if you're going with what the episode postulates, is the fact that having to adapt to these is breaking the pilots.
Yeah, it says you can't adapt to that kind of reaction time. People can't do that.
No, I suppose you can buy the fact that this ultra G-force is giving them psychological and physical problems.
Yeah.
But the miracle is that they don't crash into each other.
Yes, I mean, I can understand it's like a speed or a smoothness they're not used to or something. They're not getting G-forces or something very odd is happening to them. But you think that being absent G-force would actually make things easier, because that'd be like, I'm playing a flight simulator. I'm safe on the ground because basically you're not being affected by the motions around you.
Going on the basis, and this could be a false statistic that I've heard before, but it's the equivalent of the forces that your body undertakes when you're on a roller coaster is similar to being in a car crash.
Yes.
So you've got the idea of you're doing this kind of ultra fast, say,
Immelman turn.
An ultra fast Immelman turn in one of these crafts, and it's just, slamming your brain from one side to the other and causing this kind of psychological effect. So, yeah, I'll buy that. I can believe that flying these spacecrafts is just essentially breaking the pilots.
Yes.
One after another, and we're just sacrificing these pilots in an endless line to test the crafts with the logic of they knew what they signed on for.
I don't think anyone quite knew what they signed on for there. Immelman turn, of course, should make me think of the actual aerodynamic maneuvers, but will always make me think of the anime Last Exile, because Immelman turn is said about once per episode.
It is a real thing.
It is a real thing, but that's what I think of.
In fact, I think even Mulder mentions the Immelman turn in the episode when he's
does.
trying to get the Mr. Budahas to kind of recall things that happened.
He does. I actually think I made a note of it. Immelman turn with 8 Gs, and that causes Mr. Budahas to flounder. And he shouldn't be doing that.
This is in the sequence that Nick mentioned in his summary, in which Mr. Budahas is returned and his wife is ardently saying, "That's not my husband," which is a bit of a bizarre thing to say, as the only thing that seems to cause Mr. Budahas to break down a little is that he has all his usual memories, such as his date of birth and his kids' names, but can't remember anything about being a pilot. And therefore, when Mulder asks him a question about Immelman turns, he suddenly realises he can't recall this information and panics.
Yes, it shouldn't be gone from his memory. Of course, we'll find later on the military have a memory wipe technique, which is curious.
Yeah, it's portrayed as being a kind of combination between an injection and eye drops, it looks like, when they do it to Mulder.
Yeah, it's not clear which bits are which. I mean, that could just be anaesthetic before he's gone under. It looks like it could be a surgical procedure, which is kind of grisly.
It's very quick, whatever they do, because they managed to do it in the space of Scully driving to the base.
Yes.
And also it's memory loss like a scalpel, so it can excise just one specific memory from a person, a bit like the flashy thing in the Men in Black movies.
Yes. It's interesting as well that Mulder isn't affected in the same way as the other pilots, because the suggestion is that the first pilot we saw brought back, who I don't think we get his name, he's never recovered from it. Mr. Budahas is mostly okay, but he's missing this bit of memory, whereas Mulder's kind of on that line. But it seems to be the success record isn't great on this, whatever they're doing.
It could be an indication that they're improving the procedure.
It could.
The first guy, I think you described it as being autistic, but to me it was a bit more like he'd been lobotomized.
Yeah, there's a sense of that.
There's a sense that he's now they've got him kind of in a calm place where he can fixate on making flies for fly fishing, but that's about all he can do.
Yeah.
But Mr. Budahas is mostly okay. He just isn't going to be a pilot anymore.
Yes, which is unfortunate because this has been his entire life.
I imagine he's probably got decent healthcare under the military, at least.
Well, yeah, they probably want to keep him and his wife on side so they don't keep calling the FBI.
Mm.
The one bit I did like in this episode as well, though, was Scully saying she's not going to put down in her reports that we've seen UFOs, and Mulder just calmly says, unidentified flying objects. What else would you call what we saw?
He's right.
And he is entirely correct. That is the definition of UFO. Of course, they don't use UFO anymore, do they? It's unidentified aerial phenomenon is now the actual phrase.
Which again would describe this, I suppose.
It would, but I think it's the difference between flying object implies physical thing, whereas aerial phenomenon means it could be other environmental factors that are generating what you're seeing.
Point.
It's a catch-all. I mean, there's certainly a real-world conspiracy angle there to say that you redefine UFO, why you redefine UFO, and for what purpose.
When we mention the fact that Scully in this episode is a changed person, we note that even Mulder does not seem to trust Scully in the same way as he did in the first episode either.
No.
You have this idea that Scully is ardently trying to get Mulder to leave this alone because Scully perceives this as being dangerous, messing with the military in this way, so Mulder will accept the help of two stoners, who might be absolutely off their mind on whatever they're taking, over his partner.
Very sceptical of their ability as witnesses because they sneak into the base to smoke weed. And
we've mentioned that Mulder had this kind of mind wipe technique on him. We haven't really talked about what he saw.
Yes, I was going to say, it's interesting. There were two bits to this. One, that he generally sees a black triangle vehicle that swoops out of the sky nearly silently and hovers above him in a way that no real craft can do at the moment.
Which does look a lot like that black triangle in his photograph as well.
Yep. He does also get wheeled past it kind of amusingly when he gets his memory wiped. Because the memory wipe room and the hangar for the UFO are in the same part of the base, apparently.
It's obscured by a kind of layer of plastic wrap,
yeah.
I seem to remember, so he can only see its shadow.
Yeah, and then he loses that. I mean, he does it, say to a deep threat at the end, basically, I saw something, but they took it from me. Deep Throat, interestingly, doesn't actually say... No, he does, doesn't he? He says, is that what you thought you'd find, the military-made UFOs?
Mm.
He also does confirm that aliens are real and have been on Earth for a very long time.
You also have something I found interesting, and possibly the only thing I could tie back to the pilot, was the nature of this craft when it hovers over Mulder, because much like in the pilot, Mulder stands in a bright ray of light as the ship is passing over him, which is what they see in the forest and pilot. However, this time we see the ship that's projecting this, and it's not a UFO, it's a government ship.
Yes.
Which again could pour doubt onto the pilot, because we don't know what this entity in the woods was. Is it really aliens, or is it actually the government?
That's a very good point, and we'll have to keep an eye on that going forward.
There is quite a clear divide between Mulder and Scully's way of looking at a situation in this, which is my background and my degree, as you're probably not aware because I don't think we brought it up yet, is I have a master's in philosophy. And there is a concept in philosophy that we always illustrate as an argument with buckets, which is a posteriori logic versus a priori logic. So an a priori argument would be Mulder, as Mulder's argument would postulate all buckets hold water. And he will say this beyond a shadow of a doubt because he has experienced buckets holding water before. Whereas Scully is a posteriori thinking. A posteriori thinking would kind of posit the fact that you can't say that all buckets hold water unless you have examined every bucket.
Okay.
So that's the scientific analytic method, whereas Mulder is more the philosopher of, I can just believe this because I need to believe in something. Scully would need to have the evidence to do so.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely see that. That does seem to fit the two of them. Pretty consistently as well.
That would be Mulder as an a priori thinker versus Scully as an a posteriori thinker. So you're learning something about philosophical mode of thought in this. Who knew from this podcast?
Anything else for this episode?
I think that's about all I've got. Do you have anything more?
I think that's everything. So we also watched the episode Squeeze, which is probably one of the most famous early episodes of the X-Files, and certainly one of the more popular ones in the very early days. This was originally broadcast on the 24th of September 1993, directed by Harry Longstreet, and written by Glenn Morgan and James Wong. Notable guest stars are Doug Hutchinson, who plays Toombs. He also played Percy Wetmore in The Green Mile, and we haven't seen this, but the Polaroid Man in Millennium. The other guest star of note is Donald Logue, who played Agent Colton. In other things you might have seen him in, he is Chief Brian Irons in Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. He's also played himself in What We Do in the Shadows, the TV version. And he was Quinn in Blade, who was Stephen Dorff's sidekick and the one who says we're going to be naughty vampire gods. And so I'll leave it to Kim to give this summary of Squeeze.
Our cold opening, we see a businessman returning to his place of work after hours. He's being stalked through the building by some unseen presence, who follows him, first appearing to climb up the elevator shaft, but later coming in through an air vent that looks very, very small, set high up in the wall. He attacks the man inside his office very violently and with such force it actually cracks the door behind him. After the credits, it cuts to Scully, who's having lunch with a friend of hers from the training academy, Agent Colton. They're discussing a mutual friend who has recently been promoted. Colton, who works in the Violent Crimes Division, is quite jealous about this, but he's hoping that his latest case will break his career. This is an investigation into the murder we saw at the start. The murder is a locked room mystery that's stumping Colton quite badly. There are really no clues to go from. The man was attacked violently in his own office, and his liver was torn out for some unknown reason, seemingly by the assailant's bare hands. Colton asks for Scully's help to build a profile on the killer, insinuating that it could also be her way off the X-Files. Scully requests to bring Mulder along. Colton's not keen on this, as he doesn't like Mulder by reputation, but Scully insists as Mulder is her partner. The two of them investigate the crime scene, Mulder rubbing Colton up the wrong way as they do so. There doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence on site, though Mulder eventually finds a weird fingerprint on the outside grille of the air vent. The fingerprint looks vaguely human, but is much too long and thin to actually be so. When discussing the case with Scully later, Mulder likens this to a few X-Files he has on records. The crimes on the X-Files have the same pattern and the same kind of locked room elements about them. The only strange thing about them, really, other than, of course, livers being ripped out by someone's bare hands, is the fact that these murders have occurred 30 years apart for the last 90 years, each time the killer killing 5 people and then seemingly disappearing for the next 30 years. Scully uses the evidence they found at the crime scene to build a profile. stating that the killer is probably aged 25 to 30 years old, is a loner, is working in a certain kind of profession, and is likely to return to the scene of the crime. She presents this case file and Colton is very satisfied, so Scully stakes out the office building. She does indeed catch a man seemingly hiding inside the air ducts. He turns out to be a pest control agent named Eugene Victor Toombs. Toombs claims he's there investigating a report that there is a dead cat in the vents. Toombs is interrogated and submitted to a polygraph test. He does pass this, proving he's not the killer, bar a couple of weird questions that Mulder has inserted in there, asking things like, is he over 100 years old? He fails these questions, though he's still ruled out as the killer because Colton and his fellow agents in the Violent Crimes Division determined that these questions were unfair and anyone would have really failed them. Following this, there is another murder, this one occurring in a well-to-do gentleman's personal home. We do see Toombs actually committing this murder. He manages to contort his body so he is very, very thin and slip down the chimney. Once he has killed this man, we also quickly learn that he is taking trophies. He removes a small vase or candle holder from the mantelpiece after killing the man and removing his liver in the same manner as the first murder. Mulder insinuates that this makes this the actual fourth killing of Toombs' new cycle. There are a couple that occurred prior to the start of the episode. That means that Toombs has one more victim potentially before he disappears again. While investigating the scene of the crime, Mulder also finds another fingerprint. When he and Scully analyse this, they discover that the fingerprints, if they are shrunk down and compacted, do match the prints that they took from Toombs when he had the polygraph test. They also visit a investigator in a care home. He was a man who investigated the first wave of crimes decades before. These occurred in an area called Powhatan Mill. The man also cited that Toombs was present for these crimes. He even shows a picture showing a man that looks identical to Toombs as he does in present day. This leads Mulder to begin building a profile on Toombs as the actual assailant who has been alive for over 100 years. He posits that the liver has incredible regenerative properties and that Toombs, by eating these, has some way of kind of entering a state of torpor and surviving 30 years before he awakens to kill and eat again. Mulder and Scully visit Toombs' home as it was at the time of the original Powhatan Mill murders. They find that the building is now dilapidated and doesn't look lived in, but they do find a hidden hole in the wall that when they climb down into the coal cellar beneath the house, they find all the trinkets that have been taken from the previous crimes, as well as what appears to be a large wasp's nest, human-sized, made of shredded newspapers and rags all stuck together with bile, which is a substance produced by the liver. From this, they have the evidence they need, and Mulder is absolutely dead certain that Toombs is some kind of genetic mutant and is the one responsible for all the killings. Mulder arranges a stakeout on Toombs' apartment, but very quickly Colton calls this off, saying it's a waste of resources as it's clear that Mulder is crazy and that Toombs cannot be the killer. Unfortunately, as they were leaving Toombs' apartment, unbeknownst to them, Toombs was hiding in the kind of pipes up above and managed to snag Scully's necklace, taking a trinket and marking her as his fifth victim. While Mulder is at Toombs' house and finally eventually does notice the pendant and realise what's going on, Scully is alone in her apartment and is preparing to take a bath when she notices a yellowish substance, like the bile in Toombs' apartment, leaking through one of her vents. She runs through her gun but is too slow and is subdued by Toombs, who prepares to kill her. Luckily, this is when Mulder arrives, and between the two of them they manage to handcuff Toombs. In the ending scene of the episode, we see that Toombs has been incarcerated and is starting to build a new nest within his cell. As somebody arrives at Toombs' cell, an orderly, to give him a tray of food, we see Toombs kind of smiling and eyeing up that little slot on his cell door, evidently trying to weigh up whether or not he can squeeze out of the cell.
Thank you. And also, as the children's novel says, nothing's too big if you just know how to squeeze. So I think how the novella
something
ends.
like that at the end of the novella.
So we've got a genre shift, I think. So the first episode of The X-Files, the pilot, was kind of horror, but very sci-fi. The second one was straight up sci-fi. Now we're into the horror phase of The X-Files. At the time, this was a genuinely quite unsettling episode.
It was Chris Carter's belief at the time that The X-Files couldn't carry itself just on the conspiracy, so he determined early on that they would have to have what are called Monster of the Week episodes, these kind of standalone horror creature features that would help break up the tone of the series. I also have some interesting trivia for the creation of this episode as well, because, as I will hasten to admit, I personally prefer a lot of the Monster of the Week episodes to the conspiracy, so these are my thing. I love, love horror stories.
What do we call these episodes?
Going forward, I will often, I'm sure, slip and refer to them as Motwo episodes. This is, from me as a child, misreading the acronym MOTW, but in our household, we have started calling them Motwo episodes. I apologise in advance. Please don't correct me too much on it. I know it's wrong.
It's a great shorthand. I like it.
Okay. So, this episode, the inspiration actually, and quite surprisingly, came from Silence of the Lambs. The idea is that in Silence of the Lambs, it presents a lot of scenes where the horror is created from the stillness of the villain, which makes him look uncanny, which you can particularly see in the scene when Toombs is taking the polygraph. There's very little movement, yet he's incredibly sinister, just like Anthony Hopkins was in Silence of the Lambs.
Okay, that's interesting.
The other interesting thing to note is that although we've noted that Toombs himself is played by Doug Hutchinson, there are actually two people playing the role of Toombs throughout this. There is very little CGI in this episode, other than a few odd effects to make his fingers look longer and things like that. All of the scenes in which Toombs actually squeezes are done by a contortionist who was known only as Pepper.
Oh, okay.
They were actually very surprised by this, I found when I was reading a bit about the episode the other day, is they thought they would have to do a lot more CGI, but Pepper turned out to be a lot more flexible than they were expecting and just did most of the stunts needed of them.
Cool. One thing I would sort of steal your line, which unfortunately was basically the opening of the episode. We see Toombs in a sewer grate. In this case, it's a thing we've seen quite a lot recently. I mean, we actually saw it in the 90s as well with Stephen King's It.
Hiya, Georgie.
So someone else who's hanging around in the sewer grate along with Pennywise. I don't know if I say earlier. In this case, yes, Seth Green was also in Stephen King's It, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
He's the man who ran into William V. Davis. It all comes full circle. It's a great horror episode, I think, this one, just because it was unnerving, glowing eyes in the darkness. The inexplicable part where Toombs crawls up a elevator cable and then goes into the air ducts.
Yeah, I'm not sure what was going on with that, other than it throws you off a bit.
It throws you off, but I think it's also to make clear that he was coming in via some route, but that doesn't quite make clear. I did notice in terms of production that in both murders we see the victim very visibly toys with the trophy before the killing happens.
Ah, yeah, it's the little snow globe with the first one.
Yeah, so we see him messing with it on his desk, and you see the other guy nudge it on the mantelpiece just to make sure you know what's going to go missing shortly.
Mm. Though I believe the first one, it doesn't really draw your attention to it. It's just if you're looking for it, It's not on his desk anymore.
Some other interesting bits and pieces is talking about serial killers over lunch doesn't seem like the best idea, but I think Scully apparently has a strong stomach for this kind of thing. I think we get to see some of Scully's thought processes, because when she hears about the impossible crimes, as in these people have been killed, but basically they've died in sealed rooms where basically no one should be able to get in and then get out again, she just proposes suicide, which is the very logical conclusion until you add in the liver has been torn out and is now missing. And so in addition to toying with like the snow globe and the glass thing on the mantelpiece, Mulder also hooks Scully's necklace very blatantly as well, which is kind of an intimate gesture, really.
Yeah, a really random intimate gesture just to draw your attention to, I think, early in the episode that she's wearing this kind of oversized pendant.
Yeah.
I don't think we generally see very often, because in the earlier episodes, at least, she's always wearing a crucifix.
Yes. The other thing, of course, is there's some Mulder and Scully flirting going on in this episode. It's like when they go to the first crime scene and he's asking Scully why they didn't want him around, and she says, "Oh, well, they think your methods are," and trails off, and Mulder's spooky. And then he says, "Do you think I'm spooky?" There's flirting going on. It's just kind of unexpected, given that one of the inspirations for the series was explicitly to not have flirting. Although, to be fair, in the Avengers, the entire Avengers was based on Emma Steele and John Steed flirting with each other, but not going anywhere because Emma Peel was married. Her husband might have been missing for I can't remember how long, and he turned up in the final episode. But that was the whole thing, was the sexual fission between them.
I also felt the bit that Scully in this episode is developing as a character. As we said in Deep Throat, she's really down on Mulder and his methods. But in this one, it's kind of clear that Scully can talk smack about Mulder, but no one else can. Because she's very quick to defend him when Colton insults him.
Yes. But again, it's the whole, does Mulder actually need help? Because he has the whole reticular liver routine, which I think this is a very dark and kind of scary episode, but we've got this almost standard routine from Mulder about liver and onions and how much they go for on reticulae from greyskin aliens.
That works well because Colton thinks that he's being entirely serious when he says this due to his reputation.
And the bizarre side note I've got here is that reticulin He calls it a Reticulan galaxy, though Zeta 2 Reticulan is a planet from Alien, where they find the moon with the crashed ship on.
It's playful, and I think you do need it. You need, in a really dark episode like this, you need a little bit of humour just to break things up, even if it's dark humour.
Yes, and the flirting. And in addition as well, though, Scully being the skeptic in this one she is skeptical at first. I mean, she does ask Mulder if he really thinks it's aliens, and Mulder immediately shoots this down. This is not an alien conspiracy episode at all. But despite her protests of Toombs' age and the whole liver eating thing and all the rest of it, she doesn't put much resistance. About halfway through the episode, she's convinced that it's Toombs, and she's not. I don't know if she's accepted how he's doing it, but she's not pushing back at all. Not like she was in Deep Throat.
I think you've got the advantage of it fits both of their profiles.
It does.
Scully does profile him perfectly with his age and his attitude and him returning to the crime, which I'm not sure exactly why Toombs does return to the scene of that crime, but it still fits Scully's profile.
Although, if it could be accurate, it's completely blown her profile because she thinks he's 30 to 40 years old and he's 93.
But he appears to be 30 to 40
He does appear.
25 to 35 years old. But on the other hand, it fits Mulder's profile exactly because he is a genetic mutant who eats human livers.
Very true. So they were both right, but I think it might be trying to develop a point about Scully is that if you give her unambiguous empirical evidence, she will believe you.
Mm.
So it does strike me that going forward, if Mulder can provide her with incontrovertible proof of alien life, Scully's going to believe it.
You definitely get that in this episode, even though she doubts Mulder can be correct about Toombs at first. And indeed, I don't think she ever gets that truth that he is necessarily over 100 years old. But in the end of the episode, she is saying that they have done preliminary studies and can see that his musculoskeletal structure is abnormal.
Yes.
So she has got her empirical proof of his ability to contort himself, at least.
Yes, and the photos of him in the 60s.
Again,
which isn't
you could argue that
argue.
it's a grandfather he looks a lot like, or something like that.
You could. I think your point before that, I think it is worth sort of going into that. This point about Toombs returning to the scene of the crime and how that makes sense from a serial killer profile. It doesn't make sense for Toombs.
It's very clear Toombs has two modes in this episode. Although he's very introverted and very quiet, he can at least masquerade as a human.
Yes.
But when he's on the hunt, he's a wild animal. He's predatory, he's got the glowing yellow eyes, he's absolutely savage.
He's very jaundiced.
Yeah, I guess kind of tying in with your he eats liver motif, he's got the yellowy skin and eyes that make him look a bit jaundiced. But he is just a hunting animal, and there is absolutely no reason he would return to the initial scene of the crime.
No, recapturing the high, it's not about the high for him, this is about survival, so...
Especially as he's returning there at night when there's absolutely no one there, and it's kind of just from him stalking this guy that he got the first guy in the...
Yeah, I mean, it's not mentioned in any of the behind-the-scenes thing, but it's almost as if this is the result of two drafts that haven't quite merged together properly.
Though I will note here, as I think you touched on it before, is the fact this is another one that has a middle-grade novel adaptation.
Yes,
so,
inexplicably.
Again, bizarrely, that's the middle-grade novels, the ones for the pre-teens, and given that this is quite a nasty episode, I'm surprised it's not one of the young adult ones.
I mean, this was legitimately the scariest episode, because the cold open is just the whole, I have no idea what's going on, this is absolutely terrifying.
It's I think even scarier for me still was the second time Tomb strikes with the man alone in his house.
Yes.
Is quite a long, intense scream, and it has a kind of fake out where you think Toombs is coming down the chimney, but he's already in the room and he's right behind the guy. This is a bit scary for kids, but I will also note is that the novel is, unlike Pilot, this one is very close to the finished product.
It is very good. There are very few differences.
There's a few weird differences, like the fact that Toombs takes the snow globe from the second crime, not the first one.
Yeah.
But they're insignificant, and even the dialogue is very similar to the finished episode.
Which does indicate the script was basically there when this was handed over. The other thing is, when they actually pull about the duck, though, it's hard not to sort of think that, I don't know, I've got two conflicting experiences when they sort of see him come out the duck when they arrest him the first time. Is the whole, he looks too young, and he sort of look, that can't possibly be him. At the same time, there is something really unsettling about him, which could come back to your Anthony Hopkins. There's a stillness to his performance.
It's particularly in that polygraph scene where he just doesn't move. All he does is kind of give single-word answers.
Yeah.
The other thing, and to be fair, Toombs is a pretty perfect episode. It is a very, very good self-contained horror story. But the bit where they visit the previous investigator, who waxes on about how the scene of Toombs's crime in the original ones, the Powhatan Mill ones,
Yes.
makes him think of the Holocaust. Just feels tasteless to make that comparison.
It does. I mean,
to cite it on somebody who kills 5 people every 30 years versus genocide.
Yes, it's a bit of... I mean, the thing it reminded me the most of was the comic from Hell, which is Alan Moore's comic about Jack the Ripper. And it's particularly the notion with the last killing that William Gull in the comic says to his accomplice, I've delivered the 20th century with the last murder. It feels like that's what they were kind of grasping towards, but didn't get there.
I see.
It feels very flimsy to try and make this connection.
Yeah, the thing it reminded me of was the film Session 9, which of course came after Tombs, but it's that concept of there is this inherent evil that can live in men's hearts. You know, the portrayal of evil like an entity that can possess people, which is kind of fits in with the way the guy was describing that when you went to the scene of Powhatan Mill, he could just feel this evil, and Mulder says a similar thing when they go into Tombs' apartment. Which is bizarre, you know, Toombs himself is an animal, he's not possessed by an evil spirit or anything like that. And to me, that kind of just didn't really fit in with the rest of the episode.
No, but I would say hold that thought, because I've got a comment on that. I'll get to that in a bit.
Okay.
I'll leave you intrigued at what I found about this bit.
I am very curious.
It should be noted as well that maybe we should have done this episode next year, because 2023 will be 30 years after Squeeze's first broadcast, at which point, according to Mulder's speculations, Scully is meant to be in charge of the FBI.
And also Toombs will be waking up and starting his killing spree again.
Exactly. So,
assuming he got out of that prison cell.
Yep. So for everyone who's worried, bury yourself in concrete now, because Toombs is going to wake up next year.
I suppose you've got the possibility that Toombs is either still in his prison cell, or he didn't eat enough livers, so he's passed away because his metabolism couldn't take it. That's the best case scenario we've got at this case, I feel.
Middle grade novel said he doesn't need the fifth.
Oh, sorry. Middle grade novel says that if Toombs got out that little slot, he's coming for you next year. You specifically.
You specifically. But yes, we will also check in on, I think when we get to Series 11, we'll be able to check on Scully's progress to becoming head of the FBI. Let's keep that in mind. I'm sure we won't have forgotten about it by then. Other little trivial things are Mulder wears reading glasses, which I think is the first time we've had the opportunity to see he does that.
And infers that microfiche makes him feel sick.
Yes. I think the other interesting thing we had a debate on, and I think actually this tied into when we watched Jeepers Creepers Reborn over the weekend as well, and it's the question of these supernatural forces that sleep for decades or centuries of time, decades I think more so in Jeepers Creepers and Tombs, but then get up and can resume their lives. And it's the impossibility of this in the modern world where you have things like social security and bank accounts and addresses. It's how can you get away with this? Because people are going to say, no, that social security number says you were 90.
To put this in perspective for this episode, we make clear that Toombs has managed to keep the same apartment in his little nest without being discovered over 90 years. He has also woken up this year and managed to immediately get a job as a pest control agent.
Which he had before in the 60s as well.
In the 60s as well. I don't think you see it in this episode. He's also driving a van, so he's also got a car from that as well.
He's also able to drive, so he's able to do all these things. This case of, but how is he actually hanging on to this stuff?
It's got to be the suspension of disbelief, I feel, for this episode.
But in sort of strictly realistic terms, Toombs is out of luck very fast. He has to live in the sewers or something.
If I'm going to pick holes in this episode, and this is literally a massive hole as well, when we mention Toombs' apartment is when he's got the power to squeeze himself through a tiny gap, potentially even the food slot in a prison cell door, why does he have a massive hole to his secret lair in his apartment that Mulder, a 6'1" male, can easily fit through?
Yep, into a coal cellar where he's got his little nest. Yeah. It doesn't quite make sense. And also, the trophies. Those trophies are in remarkably good condition for being in a coal cellar for 30, 60, 90 years.
Could be the first thing he always does is polish his little trophies.
So he crawls out of his bile nest, gets a cloth from somewhere, and just sort of painstakingly wipes everything down.
And then goes out and eats some liver.
Okay, so that modus operandi of Eugene Victor Toombs there. I think you also noted as well the case of, so his nest is constructed of bile, rags, and newspapers, and they can't smell it from across the room. This is a gigantic pile of bile.
It's not just across the room, it's when Mulder jams his fingers into it before he realises it's bile.
But then Scully smells it when he's done that.
Yeah. I presume it kind of follows that whole movie logic where someone's been murdered in the room and you cannot smell the blood. Until you actively see the body, the blood has no smell whatsoever.
Yeah.
X-Files bile must work under the same principle.
Absolutely. Well, the other thing as well, at the end of that scene is Toombs takes a necklace marking her as the next victim, as you said. But why? Because everyone else, he kills them and then takes the object. It's not like he's been casing the joint and said, I'm going to take that snow globe. Oh, by the way, that guy's got a liver.
True, I suppose it's just the snap thing of something small that he can take and then still slip through the air duct.
Yeah, I think it's basically to serve the tension of, he's going to come for Scully, basically.
And the whole, assuming that Scully is going to not have her liver ripped out in episode 3, but her being unaware that this violent killer is coming for her.
Yeah, although I would say it feels unlikely for them to replace the co-star this early on, but it's not impossible, because you've got things like Tasha Yar and Star Trek Next Generation.
Or Doyle and Angel.
Where they were written out very early on, and quite surprisingly.
Mm.
So it's not impossible they would replace Scully this early on, but it's unlikely. But it does add to the tension. As does the inexplicable Mulder has a mobile phone that people don't call.
True.
Because Scully calls his apartment and does not bother with his mobile phone. I mean, admittedly, maybe they don't have exchange numbers, but I think it's a work phone.
You feel that if you're working
also
as
in
an
stakeout.
FBI agent, on a stakeout,
Yeah.
and also when you're in situations where you might need to contact somebody fast if there is something bad about to happen.
Yeah. And it's one of the things where they could have got around it in the script, because when Mulder tries to phone Scully later on, Toombs just cut the phone line in her apartment, so that's fine. But Scully didn't seem to have a mobile phone either. But then Scully not calling Mulder, I suppose you could have it like if he's in the coal cellar, there's no signal down there, I could buy that.
Mm.
But that's not how it's depicted, because it's very clearly Mulder's usual answer phone in his apartment. I do like the fact that it's Mulder and Scully working together to sort of pin Toombs down at the end, so it's not Mulder coming in to rescue Scully.
I would like to question why Toombs, who can hit someone with such force he shatters a door, cannot break a handcuff.
Cannot break out, or cannot squeeze out those handcuffs right in front of them.
I would work on the basis of if he can hit someone with such force they shatter a door, that he can just smash either one of them in the ribcage and incapacitate them right then.
Yeah.
But I suppose they've got their plot armour.
They've got their plot armour. They need to get them back somehow. In terms of the point of views and everything, I think for this and Deep Throat is this one's a bit better to have both points of view. Deep Throat was very Mulder-centric, whereas this one a bit more of an even split, I think.
There are scenes in which Mulder is not present and Scully is not present, so you have to kind of switch around a lot more in this.
But I mean, it's not
a majority of the scenes with Colton are from Scully's perspective.
Yeah, but it's not like in the first episode where basically everything was from Scully's point of view up to a certain point, and Deep Throat, we're following Mulder onto that military base and we get occasional bits of Scully getting back again. In this one, we get a swap between Mulder's investigation and Scully with Colton.
It's interesting, this one as well, and I suppose you've got this kind of concept that there is a conflict within the FBI versus getting the truth and actually solving the crime.
Yes.
So, they want the success. Colton just wants to find a killer, slam, done. Mulder and, to a lesser degree, Scully want the actual truth of who is doing this and why.
Yes, I mean...
So, Mulder and Scully are more aligned on this episode than they were previously, because they're both working to find this truth against Colton, who's more antagonistic.
I did think it was interesting. The end bit was the old detective when he's reading the newspaper and discovers that Toombs has been arrested at long last. The fact that Mulder and Scully spent loads of times with this guy, he gave them their files, they talked to him extensively about the case. They didn't call him to say, "Oh yeah, we've got the guy. We've got evidence on Eugene Toombs. He's in jail now."
Yeah.
So you two are rubbish at this. Anything else?
No, I think you've got all my notes on this one. Have
Okay.
you got anything more?
I have got one more thing. So, Doug Hutchinson apparently liked this role so much, he wrote a prequel episode.
Oh, yes, he did.
He did. This was a script he wrote for the X-Files, submitted it in, and it was returned unread. This is apparently for legal reasons rather than any kind of judgment call on what the episode was. But he was asked about this and did reveal a few details. The actual script isn't available to my knowledge, but it is called Dark He Was and Golden-Eyed, which is strangely similar to the title of a Ray Bradbury short story about Martian colonists called Dark They Were and Golden-Eyed.
Yeah.
That has nothing, as far as I can tell, that has nothing to do with it. It's just Golden Eyes, I think, is presumably what he was going for that. The episode, as Doug Hutchinson wrote it, specifies that Toombs was the result of an experiment to remain young and immortal. He was infused with a drug that backfired and led to him escaping an asylum, where he's been experimented on. But it also specified, this is possibly... Okay, Doug, what are you doing? Toombs was the incarnation of a ravenous, liver-eating Central American Indian god.
That feels a bit controversial.
Full of flashbacks to earlier things, and near the end would have had a confrontation between Toombs and Dana Scully.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got on the matter, but there is, and I'll try and bring them up later on, there is a list of unmade X-Files episodes, of which this is the first one of Series 1.
Oh, that's fun.
Most of the rest of them aren't genuinely unmade. They started as one thing and then were adapted to something else. The most odd one on the list, as a preview, is the one with Abraham Lincoln's ghost.
Oh, I do want to see this episode.
This was a proposed episode, was not written, and I think they didn't get too far with him. Okay, do you have anything else for either of these episodes?
No, I don't believe I do, other than my conspiracy corner.
Yes, and now, as always, we prepare for one episode this time. Only Deep Throat seems to have any bearing on conspiracies. But, we'll retroactively put Squeeze in there if it turns out this is somehow linked to the Grand Overgrown Scheme. Kim's Conspiracy Corner. Okay, so Sheet 2 on the Pepe Sylvia wall. Let's go.
Well, okay. So, the conspiracy this time, as of Deep Throat only, is taking a very different turn to what we had in Pilot. We're not so much focusing on aliens this time, but we are focusing on the trash that the aliens leave behind.
Sorry. They just couldn't be bothered to clear up after Roswell. It's crashed. Screw it. It'd be fine.
That's exactly what we're going for. So, our aliens crashed in the world-famous Roswell incident. The debris from the Roswell crash was taken to 6 different sites, one of them being Ellen's base, the one featured in this episode. These bits of alien technology over the following 50 years have been integrated into top-secret US military aircrafts. The result is aircrafts that can perform feats at much higher altitude and much faster than a commercial aircraft, but do so at the cost of the pilot, who starts to exhibit extreme psychological and physiological problems, both of which the government is doing its best to keep under wraps. In order to do so, the government works with a group of men in black who are used to intimidate and otherwise deter anyone who might look into this too closely. They have also developed an amnesia drug, which works like a scalpel and can be used to excise certain memories, which feels like a dangerous tool in their arsenal to kind of keep everything under wraps going forward. Mulder also gains an informant, the titular Deep Throat, who we don't know what his connection is to anything other than the fact that he knows things that Mulder doesn't, but evidently doesn't know everything, as he expresses to Mulder that he is interested in supporting Mulder to help him find the truth, which infers that there is something that Deep Throat wants to be known.
Thank you. And as you said before, we could perhaps connect the Black Triangle military craft in this episode to the unseen craft in Pilot.
I think that's about all we can kind of connect in this episode. Is we have the bright light from above in Pilot, and we have the ship that can cast a bright light from above, be it an alien craft or a US aircraft that has nothing to do with aliens, however you want to read the episode.
And as we noted last time, the episode is very careful not to actually mention aliens by name. It's always "they took me somewhere."
Yes. Again, other than Mulder himself using the term aliens, no one in high places does.
Yes. Okay, so if there's nothing else, as before, if you were part of the early online fandom and were engaged in putting series together about the conspiracies, I mean, admittedly, they might not have been doing it this early, this might have been a season 2 kind of thing, but we'd still like to hear about your thoughts and the conspiracies, what people thought was going to be relevant, what people thought was irrelevant. We'd like to hear from you, so if you want to email us, we're at thingsaregettingstrange42@gmail.com. On Twitter, you can get us at gettingstrange42, as Kim said before.
You can also find us on Facebook now. If you search for Things Are Getting Strange, an X-Files Rewatch podcast, you should be able to find our Facebook page.
Cool. So, yes, please let us know, and we'd love to hear from you. Our intro music is Envision by Kevin MacLeod. You can find that on incompetech.com. It's licensed under the Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. So, from both of us, thank you for listening again this week, and keep watching the skis.
I mean skies.